They anticipated she would be feeble, effortlessly subdued. They did not foresee her possessing combative expertise. However, as she maintained her position, the genuine altercation was merely commencing. Imani Coldwell harbored no desire to garner undue prominence within Benton Springs, Missouri, a municipality wherein interpersonal familiarity pervaded. She assimilated during her formative years that divergence rendered one vulnerable. Her maternal parent was accustomed to articulating, "Assimilate my progeny. It's safer via that method." Nevertheless, assimilation proved unattainable considering her standing as one of the scarce African-American youths within a locality still tenaciously adhering to established conventions. Upon attaining the age of 16, she had perfected proficiency of maintaining a subdued demeanor, refraining from excessive ocular reciprocity, abstaining from lingering within compromising vicinities, and eluding reactionary responses upon perceiving sotto voce articulations emanating from dorsal peripheries. Her concentration was directed toward academic pursuits, her fractional temporal employment at the luncheonette, and preponderantly toward her paternal grandfather, Walter Caldwell, the individual who had nurtured her subsequent to her maternal parents' demise. Walter functioned as a retired Marine and erstwhile pugilistic arts mentor. His manual extremities manifested wear, and terror accrued from annum-spanning immersion within the arena, and his vocal intonation conveyed the gravitas of disciplinary rigor. He never impelled Imani into engagement with pugilism, albeit he ensured her acquisition of the skill to safeguard herself. The terrestrial sphere lacks equity, my progeny. Preparedness must constitute your perpetual state, irrespective of contingencies. Consequently, during each matinal temporal locus preceding scholarly attendance and each vespertinal temporal locus subsequent to occupational fulfillment, she engaged in instructional routines within their garage-transformed gymnasium, percussive interactions with suspended receptacles, velocity-oriented drills, and pedestrian mechanics. She exhibited adeptness, exceptionally proficient without question. However, pugilism remained solely an exertional undertaking for her. It did not represent a pursuit she ever contemplated applying beyond those quadrilateral confines until that nocturne wherein entirety underwent transfiguration. It transpired to be a Friday vespertinal occurrence, with the atmospheric envelope saturated with late-sent seasonal calefaction. Imani had merely concluded an extended tour of duty at Grady's luncheonette, utilizing absorbent toweling to purify tabletops and maintaining equilibrium for receptacles intended for patrons who scarcely manifested attentiveness toward her. She swung her backpack dorsalwards across her bodily configuration and initiated her ambulation homewards. The paving substructure retained residual calefaction beneath her athletic pedal coverings. Her employment of the identical vehicular passage persisted along Maplewood Drive, proximally to the antiquated petroleum dispensation station, and transaxially across a constricted viaduct where the lucent illumination manifested vacillation. It constituted the most expeditious directional resolution toward her domiciliary destination, yet concomitantly entailed ambulation proximate to the parcel dorsal to Baker's Automobile Repair Emporium, a specific vicinal domain notorious for engendering disturbances. A vehicular about-face ought to have been performed upon observing them. Colton Reeves and his cohort, they constituted a quaternary configuration of individuals, leaning in opposition to the rustic cowling of an obsolete Chevrolet passenger transportation device, with nicotinic cylindrical ignitions shimmering within the attenuated lucidity. Colton, the chieftain, exemplified the archetypical case of an individual who had never been subjected to a negative injunctive. His progenitor possessed proprietary control over a quinquagenary percent of the entrepreneurial operations within the township, and his maternal parent presided over the presiding Scholastic Governance Council. That particular brand of authoritative sway permitted him to evade accountability across a profusion of circumstances. And, for the prior trimester of an annum, he had determined that Imani constituted his favorite objective of manipulation. Hark, Coldwell. His vocal articulation manifested imprecision. They had been ingesting intoxicants. Imani sustained her ambulation. Are you excessively commendable to furnish salutations now? Progress, manifest incivility. His associates emitted stifled vocalizations of amusement. She clasped the retaining strap of her backpack with amplified tenacity and augmented her tempo. What instigates your haste? We solely desire to converse. Her intellectual faculties functioned effectively. She harbored cognizance of the modus operandi of these specific interactions. Ought she to instigate a sprint of exercise, they would pursue her. Ought she to emit an elevated audio vocalization, no sentient entity would proffer assistance. Ergo, she enacted the course of action she routinely implemented, the act of disregarding them, sustaining her progression. However, on this precise nocturne, their intentions involved precluding her from the execution of that maneuver. Colton advanced into her trajectory, his dentition manifesting a substantial, malevolent configuration. His compatriots converged in dorsal propinquity. Imani's gastric tract experienced a contraction. An element of divergence pervaded this nocturne's experiential aura. Their intentions transcended the pursuit of amusement. They sought a surplusage of commodities. However, Colton harbored no cognizance of the predicament he was advancing into. Imani's pulse rate exhibited acceleration, albeit her facial visage sustained neutrality. She had assimilated the understanding that the manifestation of trepidation solely engendered intensified audaciousness. Colton oscillated upon his calcaneal perches, manifesting that languid smirk he invariably donned during instances wherein he entertained the theoretical premise that he possessed operational supremacy. The respiratory ejections originating from his organic anatomical system radiated a depreciatory intoxicant fragrance, and the fetid emanations of nicotinic materials adhered to his garments. What instigates your lamentation, Coldwell? Are you excessively commendable to socialize with our societal configuration? His compatriots, Travis, Luke, and Shane, instituted a loosely constructed hemicircular encirclement around her, situated at a spatial delineation inadequate for tactile contact, yet positioned sufficiently approximate to ensure the absence of an effortless exit vector. Imani emitted a deliberate exhalation through her nasal passages. Sustain composedness. Engage intellectual faculties. I am obligated to proceed elsewhere. She sustained a regulated vocalization, consistent and predictable, as though this represented merely another futile incidental encounter that she remained obligated to endure. She endeavored to maneuver around Colton, albeit he transposed spatially in accordance with her peregrinations. Nah, I harbor the theoretical premise that you possess a fractional temporal allotment. His smirk underwent magnification. We have manifested realistic degrees of patient endurance, have we not, brethren? Travis emitted a suppressive vocalization of amusement. Realistic degrees of patient endurance. Luke leaned interiorwards, his vocal articulation manifesting artificial tenderness. I wager that she entertains a conviction that she embodies a status of superiority relative to us. They had enacted this precedentially, cornering her within the academic concourse, articulating sotto voce commentaries, launching manipulated paper projectiles in her directional vector during formal instructional sessions. Minuscule diversions conceptualized to perpetually remind her of the unlikelihood of her societal incorporation. However, this diverged from prior iterations. This specific incident encompassed seclusion, the absence of pedagogue personnel, the non-existence of surveillance devices, and the non-attendance of gyrationally mobile transportation instruments, exclusively her, them, and the blackness of night. Her vocalization manifested amplified acuity during this particular temporal locus. Her tolerant forbearance exhibited attenuation. Colton inclined a cephalic structure, simulating a contemplative exercise. I harbor a deficiency of cognizance. What, specifically, do you other individuals contemplate? Should we extend the permission to her to execute a relocation from our location? Travis abraded his integumental covering proximate to his mandibular prominence, participating within the histrionic routine. Possibly, contingent upon her solicitation by means of amiable conversational protocols. Luke stifled the emission of an audio articulation illustrative of suppressed amusement. Possibly, contingent upon her articulatory vocalization of the term pleased. Imani detected it. Then, the transmogrification, the temporal juncture wherein affairs evolve from vexatious to menacing. Colton's distal extremities exhibited quivering actions at his bodily laterality. He was engaged in investigative inquiry, holding a position and wait to observe whether she would manifest trembling, solicit mercy, or implore forgiveness. She perpetrated neither category of response. Instead, she relinquished her backpack terminal wards to sustaining expanses of the substrate, executing rotational adjustments to her shoulder regions and shifting her gravitational distribution. Minuscule gestural articulations, yet they manifested import. Colton registered the circumstances. His smirk momentarily faltered for a hemic portion a second, albeit he swiftly compensated via reverting. "Oh, examine that phenomenon, confreres. Is she intending to aggress against our anatomical configurations?" Travis emitted a discharge of audio articulation indicative of amusement. "Oh, male entity, I am impelled to scrutinize this forthcoming spectacle." Luke applied nudging tactile persuasion upon Shane. "I anticipate that she shall abstain from manifesting vocalizations indicative of lament." Colton advanced spatially nearer, excessively proximate. Erroneous conduct. Imani had scrutinized a specific scenario by means of a centenary multiplicative quantification of occasions anteriorly within the arena, an individual manifesting a level of self-assuredness that bordered upon arrogance, proceeding inward beyond their contenders' reach delineation without harboring a comprehension of predicament into which they were voluntarily entering. She could discern the vocalization originating from her paternal grandfather, resounding within her cognitive expanses. They harbor anticipation pertaining to sentiments of dread. Abstain from granting them fulfillment of those anticipations. Permit them to accommodate into a posture of ease. Permit them to harbor the illusory understanding that they have procured triumph. Colton extended his superior appendage, his digits applying tangential friction against a protective garmental envelopment. Imani executed a strident action. Her sinistral superior appendage propelled ascendantly, circumventing his manual appendage centrifugally. Synchronously, her dextrophalangeal-enclosed manus traversed directly interiorwards into his ribcage. The percussive influence existed in a sharp, regulated configuration. Sufficient magnitude applied coercion to engender a staggered gait, albeit inadequate to perpetrate osseous breakage. Colton inhaled spasmodically, stumbling dorsally. The ocular orbs manifested extensive dimensions, manifesting the physiological state of surprise. His confreres underwent cerebral stagnation. For the inaugural temporal instance, they were abstaining from manifesting any audio articulation symbolic of levity, and Imani had not attained the culminating point. In essence, for a bifurcated percentile of a temporal second, no sentient entity implemented ambulation. Colton adopted a kyphotic positioning, grasping his ribcage, with his facial visage undergoing contortion secondary to non-belief. He had harbored no anticipation of that precise incident. Indeed, negligible elements of their collective entity had. Imani sustained her strategic positioning. Taut, with pedal extremities implanted, gravitational dissemination manifesting equilibration. Abstain from hesitating. Abstain from engaging in secondary deductive reasoning. The vocalizations articulated by her paternal grandfather resounded translucently within her cognitive expanses. What the inferno? Colton expectorated, straightening his anatomical configuration. His state of physiological shock underwent transmogrification into a sentiment of animosity. "You idiotic entity!" He lunged, in a form that embodied imprecision, manifesting solely aggressive inclination while absent of technological implementational proficiency. Imani maneuvered spatially, her gestures embodying acuteness and supervisory influence. As he charged anteriorward toward her positional setting, she elevated her cubital articular segment in a swift, efficacious motion, effectively intersecting his biological organization at a visceral expanse narrowly inferior to his shoulder. This generated a scenario in which he became decoupled from his equilibrium. His propulsive impetus operated in contradistinction to his aspiration. He stumbled interiorwards, scarce succeeding in intercepting his precipitous impact with the terrestrial substratum. His compatriots were no longer emitting audio articulations symbolic of amusement. She abstained from engaging in humorous practices. Associate. Travis executed a peregrinatory transfer dorsally. His ocular orbs were engaged in peregrinatory transferal activities between Colton and Imani. Luke manifested a sensation of uneasiness. I impart my vocal advocacy for the proposition that we consider procedure of implementing an operational termination. Colton intercepted his verbal communication. His facial expanses registered erythema secondary to sentiments of humiliation. He executed gyration once additional toward Imani, his manuals manifesting enclosure into the configuration of resistive boxing tools, his respiratory mechanism manifesting arduous exertion. He had attained the temporal juncture for the cessation of amusing activities. However, this precise circumstance was reciprocally valid. Colton implemented a swinging pugilistic endeavor characterized by its wide angular extent and by its embodiment of an absence of considerations beyond rageful incitation. Imani did not solely evade the implementational impact. She transposed interior wards, sealing the spatial delineation anterior to his cognitive apprehension of the commission of an error. A singular forceful impact, a refined, acute jabbing activity, traversed directly to his olfactory protuberance. The emitted audio-sonic effect was subtle. However, Colton staggered as though she had impacted his biological material substratum with a bludgeoning mallet. His superior appendages traversed impetuously toward his facial visoage. An aspirated vocal sonic effect deserted his superior airway passages. Hematological fluid, lacking prolific quantity, albeit adequate, generated a shattered state of confidence. Silence. Negligible sentient entities verbalized audio communications. Negligible sentient entities executed ambulatory motions. Colton's respiratory endeavors transpired apace, manifesting erraticism. His distal phalangeal extremities manifested trembling in opposition to his facial expanse. He was undergoing physiological shock, incited more prolifically by the veridicality that she had impacted his biological substratum at all relative to the actual experience of physical discomfort itself. Imani sustained a condition of physical immobility, serenely, centrally focused, equipped for impending contingencies. You are affected by mental derangement. Colton's vocal articulation vacillated. However, the articulation's intended menacing intimidation did not attain its intended directional vector. He did not wield operative sway over the operational dynamics any longer. Travis and Luke traded reciprocal visual scrutinies. They entertained diminished certitude relative to their desire to partake in the proceedings any further. Yo, Colton, I impart my vocal advocacy for the proposition that we execute a centrifugal transposition from this proximally vicinal domain. Luke's vocal articulation manifested attenuated quantity. Travis nodded. She manifests deficient worth, male configuration. Colton's mandibular articulation underwent tension. He aspired to express an articulate notion, an obligatory vocalization for the maintenance of his elevated stationing. However, negligible articulatory manifestations issued forth from the passages. His olfactory protuberance had averted osseous disruption. However, it would experience distress across the forthcoming senoidernal cycles. Imani did not communicate any vocal notions either. She manifested no solicitation to do such things. She exclusively sustained her setting in a state of physical suspension, rendering the circumstance lucid for each specific participating element that, contingent upon their expressed desire for continuation of the engagement activities, she would abstain from retreating from the situation. However, Colton's physiological organization had not been structured for participatory engagement in a pugilistic encounter that he could not conceivably attain consummatory triumph over. He implemented his protective garmental envelopment as an absorbent implement for liquidational constituents that had amassed proximally to his olfactory structure, manifesting animosity toward her with a combinatory composite constitutive animus, and an additional aspect, an aspect that he would never validate through articulatory vocalization, sentiments of trepidation. This specific circumstance has not arrived at its operational termination, he expectorated. The vocalized articulation's influence was rendered inconsequential, because, during the precise temporal locus wherein he executed gyration and furtively ambulated centrifugally, the engagement had verifiably been operationalized for a period duration. Luke and Travis exhibited equivocation anterior to the commission of adherence. Both imparted to her concluding scrutinization, not that of animus, yet that of something positioned comparatively proximate to sentiments of reverence. And subsequently, Characterized with the operational parameters of that specific instance, they had executed the peregrination away from the spatial vicinal expanse. However, Imani harbored the cognizance that this was not reflective of a consummation of operational dynamics. Imani sustained her condition of physical immobility, observantly scrutinizing Colton and his collective cohort as they executed the centrifugal displacement into the encompassing attenuation of lucidity. Her manual extremities were sustained in a condition indicative of stability. The operational dynamics of her mnemonic activities manifested regulatory supervisory influence. However, her myocardial anatomical unit was manifesting percussive exertions of such profuse intensity that she could audibly perceive the resulting effects within her auditory sensory organs. She ought to have experienced sentiments of triumphal elation, conceivably even sentiments of exoneration. Yet, in lieu of those particular sensations, an alternative variant of strained perturbation settled within her thoracic anatomical compartment. She harbored cognizance of the modus operandi governing these types of interactive exchanges. Male entities exhibiting attributes commensurate with those exhibited by Colton never incurred consummated losses in a tranquil behavioral parameter. The nocturnally suffused atmospheric envelopment manifested the aromatic emanations of nicotinic cylindrical entities and organic anatomical emanations. However, an additional sentiment was manifesting adherence to the spatial vicinal expanse, an anticipation that she could not dislodge. She grasped her backpack, swinging it dorsally across her bodily configuration, and compelled herself to execute ambulation toward her domiciliary destination as though negligible occurrences had assumed ontological instantiation, as though her integrated ontological setting had not merely undergone a spatial transposition. However, as she rounded the concluding angular configuration toward her paternal grandfather's habitation, she perceived the portical illumination undergo activation. He was sustaining a state of vigilant, watchful observation. Walter Caldwell refrained from posing interrogative statements. He did not necessitate vocalized articulation of interrogatories. His acuminate, supervisory ocular sensory organs implemented scrutinized analysis of her facial visage, obtaining articulatory and expressional data that she abstained from transmitting. He was structured via that specific architectural framework. He registered circumstances and occurrences at the preponderance of human entities which reverse obliviously. His vocal articulation was sustained at a subdued, regulatory volumetric quantity. Imani deglutinated. Negligible instrumental value existed in the undertaking of misrepresentation. Colton and his juvenile affiliations. A deliberate nod of afferent response. Walter liberated respiratory ejecta through his olfactory expanses, assuming a physical position in order to enable her transit interior wards. Interior wards. The habitation manifested the aromatic emanations of animal hide, antiquated literatures, and caffeinated beverage. Comforting, recognizable. Imani relinquished her receptacle for personal effects and situated herself at the quadrilaterally shaped surface of the culinary chamber. However, her paternal grandfather sustained his vertical positioning, with pectoral regions traversing by conjoining of the superior appendages. During a solitary centediurnal increment, were you impacted with harmful exertional force? An additional suspension for temporal assessment. Did you inflict harm upon them? She hesitated. Not on the basis of the manifestation of effective sentiments of embarrassment, yet owing to her cognizance of what the articulated query truly represented. I implemented that which you tutored me. Walter's labial expanses compressed into a narrow linear configuration. He extracted a seating apparatus and positioned himself in opposition to her bodily construct, his phalangeal extremities percussively impacting against the uppermost expanses of quadrilaterally shaped surface. Disclosed to me the chronological sequence of events. Consequently, she complied. She disclosed to him the directional ambulation homewards, the specific architectural mode via which they encompassed her, the temporal locus wherein Colton attained excessive propinquity. She disclosed to him the pugilistic impact, and the specific behavioral parameter of reservation her confederates manifested, and the specific procedural course via which they executed a retreat. When she had attained operational consummation, Walter leaned dorsally within his seating apparatus. He did not manifest any behavioral exhibitions indicative of displeasure or accusatory tendencies, solely thoughtfulness. You comported yourself appropriately, my progeny. You implemented a defensive strategy, but he permitted the vocalization to be suspended in suspension. Imani underwent physical tension. She harbored cognizance that an articulatory qualification suggestive of divergence loomed. Colton's progenitor is a male entity who entertains feelings of antipathy regarding sentiments of embarrassment. Imani harbored cognizance of that circumstance as well. Colton did not exclusively constitute an unsophisticated juvenile who derived elevated sentiments from the exertion of personal domination. His progenitor, Gerald Reeves, constituted one of the most potent male entities within Benton Springs. He maintained the superintendent of law enforcement on a state of immediate communication, and the presiding civic office holder owed him obligatory favors. And his offspring had merely experienced a transfer of his sentiments of exaggerated self-worth into the supervisory influence of a melanodermic adolescent entity who had entertained the theoretical premise of, as being defenseless, that specific circumstance would not settle amiably. Walter liberated respiratory ejecta during a gradual pace. This is not reflective of a consummatory state of affairs. Imani deglutenated the solid particulate that was obstructing the respiratory tract passageway. She harbored precognizance of that existing circumstance, because, on the subsequent matinal iteration, the entirety of the municipality would have garnered precognizance of the manifested occurrences, and not each element of the population would advocate on the basis of her defense. During the temporal locus that Imani traversed into Benton Springs High on the matinal diurnal cycle, she acquired cognizance of the scrutinizations, the sotto voce articulations, the manner via which the surrounding human elements experienced positional dislocations upon the occasion of her passing. The entirety of the township was possessed of the data. She had borne anticipatory convictions that the specific circumstance would transpire. Communications disseminated at heightened velocities within municipalities exhibiting such confined limits. However, that anticipatory precognizance did not render the experiential impact any less onerous. Certain facial visages manifested imperceptibility. Alternative facial visages manifested a state of smug self-satisfaction. And alternative facial visages, a restricted quantitative estimation of the aggregate mass, conveyed something that she had not borne witness to precedentially, reverence. However, expressions of reverence did not constitute effective protective shielding against impending events. Colton existed at no location within the present jurisdiction. However, his operational absence solely contributed to the exacerbation of current situational variables. His juvenile confederates, Travis and Luke, reclined and slumped within their habitual spatial positions at the alimentary table, eluding optic sensory apprehension. They did not engage in vocalized articulation activities. Not with her. Not with any other sentient human element. Instead, it consisted of the residue of the juvenile population implementing the action of saturating the unfilled voids. Have you acquired information pertaining to Imani? She subjected him to a physically incapacitating incident. She inflicted osseous fracture upon his olfactory structure. The narrative documentation was engendering locational mobility across its extremities. By the temporal instantiation of the trimestral instructional session, the circumstance had traversed outside the confines of her personal supervisory influence. Certain iterational variant transcriptions manifested her executing a physically incapacitating impact upon each respective member of the quaternary configuration of male entities simultaneously. Alternative iterational variant transcriptions manifested Colton manifesting vocalizations illustrative of extreme emotional distress, akin to the distress unneonate. The factual veridicality pertaining to the circumstances manifested no operative import any longer. Subsequently, the commencement of the transmission of digitalized symbolic encryptions manifested its instantiatory state of being. Anonymously identified numerical string configuration. You entertain the theoretical pretense that you embody a condition of aggressive resilience? Sustain a state of attentive vigilant apprehension with respect to your dorsal anatomical division. She maintained a scrutinizing gaze at the video display device, digital phalangeal extremities experiencing a tightening, encircling action encompassing the encompassing encasement of the device. This specific circumstance did not occasion shock. It solely functioned to certify that which she had harbored precognizance about, This situation pertained to motivations that vastly exceeded the superficial parameters associated with the entity Colton. This situation pertained to authoritative influence, and specific human elements encountered challenges in the process of incurring a consummated failure of operational implementation pertaining to this influence. During that diurnal vespertinal iterational stage, when she traversed home, Walter was sustaining a setting of watchful observational waiting. Assume a seated configuration. She abstained from lodging disagreement. She solely assumed a seated postural state. He executed a sliding directional transfer of a newspaper implementation transtabulary terminal wards to her location. The front page of the Benton Springs Gazette articulated the specific, descriptive attributes. Locally identified adolescent executes an impactive action upon the offspring entity of a presiding entrepreneurial lead entity. Law enforcement agency undertaking investigative procedures. The editorial expressed a biased, perverted interpretation of the chronological sequencing of events, pictorially displaying Colton as an affected casualty of harm and Imani as the initiating aggressor. The content expressed vocally expressed contributions articulated by Gerald Reeves, who categorized the events as a senseless implementational action exhibiting violent intent, and stated that his familial human composition was experiencing sentiments of profound psychological injury on the basis of the specific factual circumstance that a younger entity's forthcoming pathway might sustain jeopardizing influences consequent of singular episodic misrepresentation. Misrepresentation. That specific word usage was what those of that societal classification routinely expressed when societal elements exhibiting consanguineous attributes to her lineage executed forceful retaliatory actions. Imani's visceral enteric cavity underwent compression. However, she abstained from according her facial visage the authority to exhibit expressive behavioral communication of data. Walter leaned anteriorwards, his expressional manifest state experiencing a degree of operational imperceptibility. Do you visually perceive the operational dynamics they are implementing, do you not? She imparted a nod. They were rendering her the villainous entity, and, within a municipal framework of a character akin to that possessed by Benton Springs, once a narrative record was articulated via prescribed methodology. The act of altering the specific prescribed directional vector of that articulated communication proved to be operationally unattainable by means of all proximally identifiable parameters. Walter liberated a sustained emission of respiratory ejecta, utilizing a manual extremity to apply abrading tactile data upon the surface area proximally vicinal to his mandibular prominence. We have at our immediate operational disposal two accessible directional implementations, my progeny. We maintain a behavioral state characterized by vocal imperceptibility and permit the specific operative situation to experience a consummated attenuation, or Imani encountered a scrutinizing gaze, or we compel them to attend auditory attention to veridical authentication pertaining to the manifested occurrences. The choice manifested a location of suspension in the atmospheric medium between their respective personal entities, gravitational exertion acting as a load factor. She had expended her aggregately cumulative existential experience engaging in evasive implementations relative to disruptive influences, evading circumstances indicative of internal strife, evading the state of being rendered as a targeted entity. However, at this instantiation of time, she was in a state of uncertainty relative to whether she could sustain a condition of vocal impermeability. Imani maintained a scrutinizing gaze toward the journalistic periodical. The written language was manifesting a state of blurry indiscernibility. Assaults, violence, misrepresentation. They had implemented the operational substitution of the precise attributive labeling corresponding to each respective descriptive parameter. She could pre-visualize a pictorial depiction of Colton situated within the confines of his personal domiciliary dwelling, functioning in the expressional character of a casualty of societal harm, while his progenitor initiated the telephonic contacting communications with elevated societal elements in order to implement the operational propulsion of that specific narrative record in an iterative manner. If she sustained a condition of vocal impermeability, the narrative documentation would persist. It would comprise the exclusively retained variant copy accessible to those exhibiting recalcitrant operational capacity pertaining to the circumstances. Her paternal grandfather was sustaining a state of vigilant observational scrutiny pertaining to her. Permit the iteration to traverse into oblivion, or implement the forceful instigation of a retort. Across multiple accumulative anim-spanning iterational cycles, she had subsisted by means of a singular prescribed procedural guideline. Abstain from furnishing them any rationale. She had adhered to the stated prescribed guideline, and yet they had still traversed interior wards toward her. In light of preceding factual data, and given the aforementioned set of circumstances, what compelling justificatory premise compelled her adherence to a condition of vocal impermeability? I aspire to articulate vocal utterances. Her vocal manifestation sustained a condition devoid of oscillation. Walter imparted a nodding directional motion during a solitary, gradual, and firm time. Consequently, we shall execute the implementational actions appropriately. By the commencement of the matinal iterational stage, the act of operational ignitability had already achieved instantiation. Socialized communication media was manifesting operational buzz in profuse quantities. The accurate, factual rendition was undergoing propulsive dissemination. Scholastic entities were sustaining a state of communicative articulation. Instructor-based personnel were manifesting a discomfort-manifesting behavioral parameter. Designated paternal entities were sustaining a behavioral parameter indicative of effective sentiments of indignation, and were instituting formalized solicitation pertaining to responsive accounting. And subsequently, a broadcasted transmission from a news dissemination station was transmitted. Locally operationalized journalistic personnel had acquired volatile impetus from the circumstance. The scholastic architectural installation could no longer function via a neglective operational state relative to the data. Consequently, they implemented the convening of a communicative concourse. The gymnastics installation architectural construct was occupied volumetrically to its design quantitative capacity by scholastic entities, paternal entities, pedagogical personnel, and, assuredly, Colton and his progenitor. Imani situated herself adjoined to Walter. Her digital phalangeal extremities were interconnected. The gravitational load factor of centenary multiplier structural configurations weighing in excess of a ton was exerting pressure against her body, yet she refused to manifest diminishing attributes. Gerald Reeves assumed a position of ascendancy initially. He manifested a descriptive approximation that corresponded precisely to anticipatory expectations. Highly refined, operationalized in accordance with practical experience, and embodying a male entity who had sustained operational supervisory jurisdiction for an excessively protracted operational time cycle. Our genealogical human configuration has always sustained societal constructs indigenous to Benton Springs. He initiated via frictionless vocal manifestation. We place credence in the accessibility of iterative opportunities. However, my offspring entity experienced an impactful implementational action that was devoid of justificatory grounding, and at this current juncture, his publicized persona is undergoing effective detriment due to fictional narrative data. His ocular sensory organs flickered interior wards toward Imani, solely for a centisecond unit of temporal duration. Our sustained aspiration is confined to accountability implementation, that and nothing more. Sotto voce vocalizations indicative of support propagated across the assembled aggregate. Some human entities harbored feelings of affirmative advocacy. Some human entities harbored feelings to the contrary. Subsequently, the temporal locus for her to assume ascendance had arrived. Imani sustained a standing configuration, evading the method via which Gerald's scrutinizing gaze experienced an operational hardening. She liberated her respiratory tract. For a calendar spanning annum-lengthy periodicity, Colton and his affiliations have engaged in the execution of harassing methodologies directed toward me. Negligible degrees of equivocation. Negligible degrees of operational softening. The manifestation of the unbiased veridical authentication. They have engaged in procedural executions of architectural encirclement pertaining to my biological configuration. They have engaged in articulations of insults. They have engaged in propulsive ejection procedures for various objects toward my person. During that particular nocturnally suffused iterational setting, they implemented the encirclement procedure about me. I implemented retaliatory defensive maneuvers. Silence. She implemented a respiratory-based inhalation. compelling herself to engage in optic sensory engagement of their ocular sensory organs. Hypothetically, should I have been a societal element experiencing consummated failure within that pugilistic event, would we be situated in the confines of the specific architectural spatial setting at the specifically designated temporal location? That specific articulatory formulation attained its intended strategic influence. There was a measurable dislocation within the confines of the spatial location. Human societal elements were sustaining reciprocal scrutinizing gazes. Human societal elements were issuing interrogatory statements. Gerald initiated an oral cavity aperture. However, Walter vocalized prior to his articulatory emission. The authentic interrogatory is as follows. Hypothetically, should she have been a human entity manifesting albino phenotypic expression, and should Colton have manifested the operational behavioral parameters exhibiting aggressive implementational traits, would you still be in the behavioral parameters of referring to that specific event as manifesting a state of misrepresentation? The gymnastics installation achieved a volumetric level of vocal impermeability that was so extensive, it conveyed the expressional representation that the cosmological setting had undergone an operational halt. Imani registered it. The specific method by which human elements inaugurated visual perception pertaining to the microscopic fractures within the framework of the narrative account. She had vocalized her subjective perception of the veridicality pertaining to the occurrences. At this temporal location, the responsibility of the choice was vested within their collective entity. The atmospheric imperceptibility within the confines of the gymnastics installation sustained its protracted temporality beyond the preconceived anticipations of any respective human element. Imani did not relocate from her designated setting. She had articulated what required articulatory expression. Whether or not they expressed a formalized acceptance of that express communication was dependent upon their individually respective behavioral propensities. Gerald Reeves transposed relative to his seating apparatus, his mandibular articulation experiencing a compressive exertion. He was not typically subjected to the situational experience of consummatory failure. He was sustaining a temporal duration of anticipatory waiting relative to the potential of another unspecified sentient human to intervene within the operational dynamics and recapture governance relative to the collective situation. However, no sentient human implemented said undertaking. A vocalized utterance, originating from within the amassed collective, disrupted the exerted pressure. She is articulating veridical data. Imani transposed her cephalic sensorium. The human entity communicating the vocal utterance was designated under the appellation of Mrs. Delgado, the mathematical science's specialized pedagogical entity. She was not an individual characteristically predisposed toward communicative articulations relative to her internal sentiments. However, there she stood, with articulated pectoral extremities and gazingly fixated directional guidance upon Gerald. Should that have manifested via a procedural parameter that was characterized via the engagement of my genotypical progenerative human offspring entity, we would not be engaging in contentious deliberations pertaining to this matter at this temporal location. Supportable. Murmurs followed. A few heads nodded. Then another voice. Colton's been a bully for years. This time it was Jennings, a junior who had been in and out of fights with Colton since middle school. We all know it. The room was shifting. Gerald could see it. His face darkened, but he forced a tight, controlled smile. We're not here to dig up the past. We're here to talk about what happened that night. And what happened that night is your son got exactly what he deserved. That voice stopped everything. It came from the entrance of the gym. Colton, he looked different. His usual cockiness was gone, replaced with something else. Resignation. Embarrassment. Maybe even regret. Gerald whirled around. Colton, sit down. No. Colton's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. I started it. I lost. That's it. Another wave of murmurs. This was unexpected. Gerald's hands clenched into fists, but Colton wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes flickered toward Imani just for a second before he shook his head and left. The weight in the room changed. The moment had shifted permanently. There was no more fight left in this. The school board shuffled awkwardly, realizing they had no choice but to move on. Walter leaned over and patted Imani's hand. You did good, baby girl. And for the first time, she actually felt it. Imani hadn't just defended herself that night. She had forced a town to face its own reflection. People like Gerald Reeves would always exist. They would twist stories, rewrite history, and expect the world to bow to them. But people like Imani, they reminded the world that truth has a way of fighting back. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always safe. But when you stand your ground, the right people will listen.